Chapter 16 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 16. The Coming of Night. It was not yet full dusk, for the shadows were still swinging out from the mountains and a ghost of color lingered in the west. But midnight lay in the open eyes of Jerry Strann. There had been no struggle, no outcry, no lifting of head or hand. One instant his eyes were closed, and then, indeed, he looked like death. And the next instant the eyes opened. He smiled. The wind stirred in his bright hair. He had never seemed so happily alive as in the moment of his death. Fatty Matthews held the mirror close to the faintly parted lips, examined it, and then drew slowly back towards the door, his eyes steady upon Mac Strann. "Mac," he said, "it's come. I've got just this to say. Whatever you do, for God's sake, stay inside the law." And he slipped through the door and was gone. But Mac Strann did not raise his head or cast a glance after the marshal. He sat turning the limp hand of Jerry back and forth in his own, and his eyes wandered vaguely through the window and down to the roofs of the village. Night thickened perceptibly every moment, yet still, while the eastern slope of every roof was jet black, the western slopes were bright, and here and there at the distance the light turned and waned on upper windows. Sleep was coming over the world, and eternal sleep had come for Jerry Strann. It did not seem possible. Some night at sea, when clouds hurtled before the wind across the sky, and when the waves leaped up mast high, when some good ship staggered with the storm, when hundreds were shrieking and yelling in fear or defiance of death, there would have been a death scene for Jerry Strann. Or in the battle, when hundreds rushed to the attack, with one man in front like the edge before the knife, there would have been a death scene for Jerry Strann. Or while he rode singing, a bolt of lightning that slew and obliterated at once, such would have been a death scene for Jerry Strann. It was not possible that he could die like this, with a smile. There was something incompleted. The fury of the death struggle which had been omitted must take place, and the full rage of wrath and destruction must be vented. Can a bomb explode and make no sound and do no injury? Yet Jerry Strann was dead, and all the world lived on. Someone cantered his horse down the street and called gaily to an acquaintance, and afterwards the dust rose, invisible, and blew through the open window and stung the nostrils of Mac Strann. A child cried faintly in the distance, and then was hushed by the voice of the mother, making a sound like a cackling hen. This was all. There should have been wailing and weeping and cursing and praying, for handsome Jerry Strann was dead. Or there might have been utter and dreadful silence and waiting for the stroke of vengeance, for the brightest eye was misted, and the strongest hand was unnerved, and the voice that had made them tremble was gone. But there was neither silence nor weeping. Someone in the nearby kitchen rattled her pans and then cursed a dog away from her back door. Not that any of the sounds were loud. The sounds of living are rarely loud, but they run in an endless river, a monotone broken by ugly ripples of noise, to testify that men still sleep or waken, hunger or feed. Another ripple had gone down to the sea of darkness, yet all the ripples behind it chased on their way heedlessly and babbled, neither louder nor softer. There should have been some giant voice to peal over the sleeping village and warn them of the coming vengeance, for Jerry Strann was dead. The tall, gaunt figure of Haw Haw Langley came on tiptoe from behind, beheld the dead face, and grinned. A nervous convulsion sent a long ripple through his body, and his Adam's apple rose and fell. Next he stole sideways, inch by inch, so gradual was his cautious progress, until he could catch a glimpse of Mac Strann's face. It was like the open face of a child. There was in it no expression except wonder. At length a hoarse voice issued from between the grinning lips of Haw Haw. "Ain't you going to close the eyes, Mac?" At this the great head of Mac Strann rolled back, and he raised his glance to Haw Haw, who banished the grin from his mouth by a vicious effort. "Ain't he got to see his way?" asked Mac Strann, and lowered his glance once more to the dead man. As for Haw Haw Langley, he made a long gliding step back towards the door, and his beady eyes opened in terror. Yet a deadly fascination drew him back again beside the bed. Mac Strann said: "Kind of looks like Jerry was riding the home trail, Haw Haw. See the way he's smiling?" The vulture stroked his lean cheeks and seemed once more to swallow his silent mirth. "And his hands," said Mac Strann, "is just like life, except they're getting sort of chilly. He don't look changed none, does he, Haw Haw? Except that he's seeing something off there, away off there. Looks like he was all wrapped up in it, eh?" He leaned closer. His voice fell to a murmur that was almost soft. "Jerry, what you seeing?" Haw Haw Langley gasped in inaudible terror and retreated again towards the door. Mac Strann laid his giant hand on the shoulder of Jerry. He asked in a raised voice: "Don't you hear me, lad?" Sudden terror caught hold of him. He plunged to his knees beside the bed, and the floor quaked and groaned under the shock. "Jerry, what's the matter? Are you mad at me? Ain't you going to speak to me? Are you forgetting me, Jerry?" He caught the dead face between his hands and turned it strongly towards his own. Then, for a moment, his eyes plumbed the shadows into which they looked. He stumbled back to his feet and said apologetically to Haw Haw at the door: "I kind of forgot he wasn't living for a minute." He stared fixedly at the gaunt cowpuncher. "Speaking man to man, Haw Haw, do you think Jerry will forget me?" The terror was still white upon the face of Haw Haw, but something stronger than fear kept him in the room, and even drew him a slow step towards Mac Strann, and his eyes moved from the face of the dead man to the face of the living, and seemed to draw sustenance from both. He moistened his lips and was able to speak. "Forget you, Mac? Not if you get the man that fixed him." "Would you want me to get him, Jerry?" asked Mac Strann, and he waited for an answer. "I don't know," he muttered after a moment. "Jerry was always for fighting, but he was never for killing. He never liked the way I done things. And when he was lying here, Haw Haw, he never said nothing about me getting Barry, did he?" Astonishment froze the lips of Haw Haw. He managed to stammer: "Ain't you going to get Barry? Ain't you going to bust him up, Mac?" "I dunno," repeated the big man heavily. "Seems like I've got no heart for killing. Seems like there's enough death in the world." He pressed his hand against his forehead and closed his eyes. "Seems like they's something dead in me. There's an ache that goes ringing in my head. They's sort of a hollow feeling inside me, and I keep thinking about times when I was a kid and got hurt and cried." He drew a deep breath. "Oh, my God, Haw Haw, I'd give most anything if I could bust out crying now." While Mac Strann stood with his eyes closed, speaking his words slowly, syllable by syllable, like the tolling of a bell, Haw Haw Langley stood with parted lips. Like the spirit of famine drinking deep, joy unutterable was glittering in his eyes. "If Jerry wanted me to get this Barry, he'd have said so," repeated Mac Strann, "but he didn't." He turned towards the dead face. "Look at Jerry now. He ain't thinking about killing. Nope, he's thinking about some quiet place for sleep. I know the place. There's a spring that comes out in a hollow between two mountains, and the wind blows up the valley all the year. And there's a tree that stands over the spring. That's where I'll put him. He loved the sound of running water, and the wind'll be on his face, and the tree'll sort of mark the place. Jerry, lad, would you like that?" Now, while Mac Strann talked, inspiration came to Haw Haw Langley, and he stretched out his gaunt arms to it and gathered it into his heart. "Mac," he said, Don't you see no reason why Jerry wouldn't ask you to go after Barry?" "Eh?" queried Mac Strann, turning. But as he turned, Haw Haw Langley glided towards him and behind him, as if he found it easier to talk when the face of Mac was turned away. And while he talked his hands reached out towards Mac Strann like one who is begging for alms. "Mac, don't you remember that Barry beat Jerry to the draw?" "What's that to do with it?" "But he beat him bad to the draw. I seen it. Barry waited for Jerry. Understand?" "What of that?" "Mac, you blind? Jerry knowed you'd be throwing yourself away if you went up against Barry." At this Mac Strann whirled with a suddenness surprising for one of his bulk. Haw Haw Langley flattened his gaunt frame against the wall. "Mac," he pleaded, "I didn't say you'd be throwing yourself away. It was Jerry's idea." "Did Jerry tell you that?" he asked. "So help me God." "Did Jerry want me to get Barry?" "Why wouldn't he?" persisted the vulture, twisting his bony hands together in an agony of alarm and suspense. "Ain't it natural, Mac?" Mac Strann wavered where he stood. "Somehow," he argued to himself, "it don't seem like killing is right here." The long hand of Langley touched his shoulder. He whispered rapidly: "You remember last night when you was out of the room for a minute? Jerry turned his head to me, just the way he's lying now, and I says, 'Jerry, is there anything I can do for you?'" Mac Strann reached up and his big fingers closed over those of Haw Haw. "Haw Haw," he muttered, "you was his friend. I know that." Haw Haw gathered assurance. He said: "Jerry answers to me. Haw Haw, old pal, there ain't nothing you can do for me. I'm going west. But after I'm gone keep Mac away from Barry." I says: "Why, Jerry?" "Because Barry'll kill him sure," says Jerry. "I'll do what I can to keep him away from Barry," says I. "But don't you want nothing done to the man what killed you?" "Oh, Haw Haw," says Jerry, "I ain't going to rest easy. I ain't going to sleep in heaven until I know Barry's been sent to hell. But for God's sake don't let Mac know what I want, or he'd be sure to go after Barry and get what I got." Mac Strann crushed the hand of Haw Haw in a terrible grip. "Partner," he said, "do you swear this is straight?" "So help me God," repeated the perjurer. "Then," said Mac Strann, "I got to leave the buryin' to other men what I'll hire. Me, I've got business on hand. Where did Barry run to?" "He ain't run," cried Haw Haw, choking with a strange emotion. "The fool, the damned fool, is waiting right down here in O'Brien's bar for you to come. He's daring you to come." Mac Strann made no answer. He cast a single glance at the peaceful face of Jerry and then started for the door. Haw Haw waited until the door closed. Then he wound his arms about his body, writhed in an ecstasy of silent laughter, and followed with long, shambling strides. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 17. Buck makes his getaway. Straight from the room of the dead man, Fatty Matthews had hurried down to the bar, and there he stepped into the silence and found the battery of eyes all turned upon that calm figure at the end of the room. Upon this man he trotted, breathing hard, and his fat sides jostled up and down as he ran. According to Brownsville, there were only two things that could make Fatty run: a gun or the sight of a drink. But all maxims err. When he reached Barry, he struck him on the shoulder with a heavy hand. That is, he struck at the shoulder, but as if the shadow of the falling hand carried a warning before it. At the same time that it dropped, Barry swerved around in his chair. Not a hurried movement, but in some mysterious manner his shoulder was not in the way of the plump fist. It struck instead upon the back of the chair, and the marshal cursed bitterly. "Stranger," he said hotly, "I've got one thing to say. Jerry Strann has just died upstairs. In 10 seconds Mac Strann will be down here looking for you." He stepped back, humming desperately to cover his wheezing, but Barry continued to braid the horsehair with deft fingers. "I got a double knot that's kind of new," he said. "Want to watch me tie it?" The deputy sheriff turned on the crowd. "Boys," he exclaimed, waving his arms, "he's crazy. You heard what he said. You know I've given him fair warning. If we've got to dig his grave in Brownsville, is it my fault? It ain't." He stepped to the bar and pounded upon it. "O'Brien, for God's sake, a drink." It was a welcome suggestion to the entire nervous crowd, but while the glasses spun across the bar, Buck Daniels walked slowly down the length of the bar room towards Barry. His face was a study which few men could have solved, unless there had been someone present who had seen a man walk to his execution. Beside Dan Barry he stopped and watched the agile hands at work. There was a change in the position of Barry now, for he had taken the chair facing the door and the entire crowd. Buck Daniels stood opposite. The horsehair plied back and forth, and Daniels noted the hands, lean, tapering like the fingers of a girl of 16. They were perfectly steady. They were the hands of one who had struggled in life with no greater foe than ennui. "Dan," said Buck, and there was a quiver of excitement in his voice, like the tremor of a piano string long after it has been struck. "Dan, I've been thinking about something, and now I'm ready to tell you what it is." Barry looked up in slow surprise. Now the face of Buck Daniels held what men have called a deadly pallor, that pallor which comes over one who is cornered and about to fight for his life. He leaned closer, resting one hand upon the edge of the table, so that his face was close to Dan Barry. "Barry," he said, "I'm asking you for the last time. Will you get your hoss and ride back to Kate Cumberland with me?" Dan Barry smiled his gentle, apologetic smile. "I don't no ways see how I can, Buck." "Then," said Buck through his teeth, "of all the lying hounds in the world you're the lyingest and meanest and lowest, which they ain't words to tell you what I think of you. Take this instead." And the hand which rested on the table darted up and smote Dan Barry on the cheek, a tingling blow. With the same motion which started his hand for the blow, Buck Daniels turned on his heel and stepped a pace or two towards the centre of the room. There was not a man in the room who had not heard the last words of Buck Daniels, and not a man who had not seen the blow. Every one of them had seen, or heard accurately described, how the slender stranger beat Jerry Strann to the draw and shot him down in that same place. Such a moan came from them as when many men catch their breath with pain, and with a simultaneous movement those who were in line with Buck Daniels and Barry leaped back against the bar on one side and against the wall on the other, their eyes, fascinated, held on the face of Barry, and they saw the pale outline which the fingers of Daniels had left on the cheek of the other. But if horror was the first thing they felt, amazement was the next. For Dan Barry sat bolt erect in his chair, staring in an astonishment too great for words. His right hand hung poised and moveless just above the butt of his gun. His whole posture was that of one in the midst of an action, suspended there, frozen to stone. They waited for that poised hand to drop, for the slender fingers to clutch the butt of the gun, for the convulsive jerk that would bring out the gleaming barrel, the explosion, the spurt of smoke, and Buck Daniels lurching forward to his face on the floor. But that hand did not move, and Buck Daniels, standing there with his back to the suspended death behind him, he drew out Durham and brown papers, without haste rolled a cigarette, and reached to a hip pocket. At that move Dan Barry started. His hand darted down and fastened on his gun, and he leaned forward in his chair with the yellow glimmering light flaring up in his eyes. But the hand of Buck Daniels came out from his hip, bearing a match. He raised his leg, scratched the match. There was a blue spurt of flame, and Buck calmly lighted his cigarette and started towards the door, sauntering. The instant the swinging doors closed, Barry started from his chair with a strange cry. None of them had ever heard the like from human lips, for there was grief in it, and above all there was a deadly eagerness. So a hungry man might cry out at the sight of food. Down the length of the barroom he darted, and was drawing his gun as he whipped through the doors. A common rush followed him, and those who reached the open first saw Buck Daniels leaning far forward in his saddle and spurring desperately into the gloom of the night. Instantly he was only a twinkling figure in the shadows, and the beat of the hoofs rattled back at them. Dan Barry stood with his gun poised high for a second or more. Then he turned, dropped the gun into the holster, and with the same strange, unearthly cry of eagerness he raced off in the direction of the barns. There were some who followed him even then, and this is what they reported to incredulous ears when they returned. Barry ran straight for the left-hand corral and wrenched at the gate, which appeared to be secured by a lock and chain. Seeing that it would not give way, he ran around to the barn and came out again carrying a saddle and bridle. These he tossed over the high fence into the corral. Then he picked up a loose scantling, and with it pried and wrenched off the top bar of the fence in one section, and vaulted into the enclosure. The black stallion had whinnied once or twice during this time, and the great black shaggy dog had come snarling and whining about the feet of his master. Now the stranger tossed on the saddle and cinched it with amazing speed, sprang onto his mount, and urged it across to the other side of the corral. Up to that moment no one in the little crowd of watchers had suspected the intention of the rider, for the fence, even after the removal of the top bar, was nearly 6 feet in height. But when Barry took his horse to the far side of the corral and then swung him about facing the derailed section, it was plain that he meant to attempt to jump at that place. Even then, as O'Brien explained later, and many a time, the thing was so impossible that he could not believe his eyes. There was a dreamlike element to the whole event, and like a phantom in a vision he saw the black horse start into a sharp gallop, saw the great dog sail across the fence first, saw the horse and rider shoot into the air against the stars, heard the click of the hoofs against the top rail, heard the thud of hoofs on the near side of the fence, and then the horseman flashed about the corner of the barn, and in an instant his hoofs were beating a far distant tattoo. As for the watchers, they returned in a dead silence to the barroom, and they had hardly entered when Mac Strann stalked through the doors behind them. He went straight to O'Brien. "Somewhere about," he said in his thick, deep voice, "there's a man named Dan Barry. Where is he?" And O'Brien answered, "Mac, he was sitting down there at that table until 2 minutes ago, but where he is now, I ain't any idea." The tall skeleton form of Haw Haw Langley materialized behind Mac Strann, and his face was contorted with anger. "If he was here 2 minutes ago," he said, "he ain't more than 2 minutes away." "Which way?" asked Mac Strann. "North," answered a score of voices. O'Brien stepped up to Mac Strann. He said, "Mac, we know what you got in mind. We know what you lost, and there ain't any of us that ain't sorry for Jerry and for you. But, Mac, I can give you the best advice you ever heard in your life. Keep off'n the trail of Barry." Haw Haw Langley added at the ear of Mac Strann, "That was Jerry's advice when he lay dying, and it's my advice too, Mac. Barry ain't a safe man to foller." "Haw Haw," answered Mac Strann, "will you give me a hand saddling my hoss? I got an appointment, and I'm 2 minutes late already." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand, Chapter 18. Dr. Byron Analysis. In the room which had been assigned to his use, Dr. Randall Byron sat down to an unfinished letter and began to write. Dinner has interrupted me, my dear Longburn. I have dined opposite Miss Cumberland, only the two of us at a great table, with a wide silence around us, and the Chinese cook padding to and fro from the kitchen. Have I told you of that room? No, I believe that I have made no more than casual mention of my environment here, for reasons which are patent. But tonight I wished that you might look in upon the scene. Along the walls hang a rope with which Mr. Cumberland won a roping and tying contest in his youth, a feat upon which he prides himself highly. At another place hang the six-shooters of a notorious desperado, taken from his dead body. There is the sombrero of a Mexican guerrilla chief beside the picture of a prize bull, and an oil painting of Mr. Cumberland at middle age adjoins an immense calendar on which is portrayed the head of a girl in bright colors, a creature with amazing quantities of straw-colored hair. The table itself is of such size that it is said all the guests at a round-up, a festival of note in these barbaric regions, can be easily seated around it. On one side of this table I sat, and on the other side sat the girl, as far away as if an entire room had separated us. Before going down to the meal I had laid aside my glasses, for I have observed that spectacles, though often beneficial to the sight, are not always equally commendable in the opinion of women, and it should assuredly be one's endeavor to become agreeable to those about us. Be it noted at this point, my dear Longburn, that I have observed peculiar properties in the eyes of Miss Cumberland. Those of all other humans and animals that have fallen under my observance were remarkable only for their use in seeing, whereas the eyes of Miss Cumberland seem peculiarly designed to be seen. This quality I attribute to the following properties of the said eyes. First, they are in size well beyond the ordinary. Secondly, they are of a color restful to behold. It is, indeed, the color of the deep blue evening sky into which one may stare for an incalculable distance. As I have said, then, I noted a glow in these eyes, though they were so immediately lowered that I could not be sure. I felt, however, an extraordinary warmth beneath my collar, the suffusion of blood passing swiftly towards my forehead. I inquired if she had smiled, and for what reason, whereat she immediately assured me that she had not, and smiled while making the assurance. I was now possessed of an unusual agitation, augmented by the manner in which Miss Cumberland looked at me out of twinkling but not unkindly eyes. What could have caused this perturbation I leave to your scientific keenness in analysis. I discovered an amazing desire to sing, which indecorous impulse I, of course, immediately inhibited, and transferred the energy into conversation. "The weather," I said, "has been uncommonly delightful today." I observed that Miss Cumberland greeted this sentence with another smile. Presently she remarked, "It has seemed a bit windy to me." I recalled that it is polite to agree with ladies, and instantly subjoined with the greatest presence of mind, "Quite right, a most abominably stormy day." At this I was astonished to be greeted by another burst of laughter, even more pronounced than the others. "Dr. Byron," she said, "you are absolutely unique." "It is a point," I said earnestly, "which I shall immediately set about to change." At this she raised both hands in a gesture of protest, so that I could observe her eyes shining behind the slender brown fingers. Observe, Longburn, that white skin is falsely considered a thing of beauty in women. And she remarked, still laughing, "Indeed, you must not change." I replied with an adroit change of front, "Certainly not." For some mysterious reason The girl was again convulsed, and broke off her laughter to cry in a voice of music which still tingles through me, "Dr. Byron, you are delightful." I should gladly have heard her say more upon this point, but it being one which I could not gracefully dispute with her, and being unwilling that she should lapse into one of her usual silences, I ventured to change the subject from myself to her. "Miss Cumberland," I said, "I remark with much pleasure that the anxiety which has recently depressed you seems now in some measure lessened. I presume Mr. Daniels will be successful in his journey, though what the return of Mr. Daniels accompanied by Mr. Barry can accomplish is, I confess, beyond my computation. Yet you are happier in the prospect of Mr. Barry's return." I ask this question with a falling heart, though I remain ignorant of the cause to which I can attribute my sudden depression. Still more mysterious was the delight which I felt when the girl shook her head slowly and answered, "Even if he comes, it will mean nothing." I said, "Then let us intercept him and send him back." She cried out, as if I had hurt her, "No, no, no," and twisted her fingers together in pain. She added at once, "What of poor Dad?" "Your father," I confessed, had for the moment slipped my mind. It seemed to me, however, that it was not wholly on her father's account that she was grieved. She wished Mr. Barry to return, and yet she dreaded his coming. It was most mysterious. However, I had started Miss Cumberland thinking. She stopped eating and began to stare before her. Presently she said, "It is strange that we don't hear from Buck. What can have held him so long?" I regretted extremely that I had introduced the topic, and cast about in my mind for another, but could not find one. I then expressed regret that I had revived her worries, but received in reply a smile in which there was no life. The very colour had died out from her cheeks, and she sat during the rest of the meal without speaking a word. Afterwards I went in with her to see Mr. Cumberland. His condition was not materially changed. The marvel of it grows upon me more and more. It is a freak which defies medical science. There lies a man at the point of dissolution. His body has died of old age, and yet the life principle remains. He does not eat, at least the nourishment he takes is wholly negligible, but he still has energy. To be sure, he rarely moves about, and his body remains practically inert, but we must never forget that the mind is a muscle and calls for continual rebuilding, and the mind of Mr. Cumberland is never inactive. It works ceaselessly. It will not permit him to sleep. For 3 days now, as far as I can tell, he has not closed his eyes. It might be assumed that he is in a state of trance, but by a series of careful experiments I have ascertained that he is constantly thinking in the most vigorous fashion. What does it mean? There is in the man a flame-like quality. Something is burning in him every instant. But on what does the flame feed? I know that material cannot be created, and that energy means dissolution of matter. But why does not the life of Joseph Cumberland dissolve? The subject possesses me. I dare not ponder it too steadily, or my brain begins to whirl. I make no progress toward any reasonable solution. I only feel that I am living in the presence of an astounding mystery. Strange thoughts possess me. What is the fire that burns but does not consume Joe Cumberland? What is the thing in the wandering Dan Barry which Kate Cumberland fears and yet waits for? Why was it that Daniels trembled with dread when he started out to find a man who, by his own profession, he holds to be his best friend? You see how the mystery assumes shape. It is before me, it is in my hand, and yet I cannot grasp its elements. The story of a man, a horse, and a dog. What is the story? Today I wandered about the great corrals, and came to one which was bounded by a fence of extraordinary height. It was a small corral, but all the posts were of great size, and the rails were as large as ordinary posts. I inquired what strange beasts could be kept in such a pen, and the man of all work of whom I asked replied That's Satan's corral." I guessed at some odd story. "The devil!" I cried. "Do they fence the devil in a corral?" "Oh, ay," said the fellow. "He's a devil right enough. If we let him run with the other horses he'd have 'em cut to ribbons. That's what kind of devil he is." A story of a man, a horse, and a dog. I think I have seen the great chain which bound the dog. Was that the place where they kept the horse? And if so, what bonds are used for the man, and what sort of man can he be? One of gigantic size, no doubt, to mate his horse and his dog. A fierce and intractable nature, for otherwise Kate Cumberland could not dread him. And yet a man of singular values, for all this place seems to wait for his return. I catch the fire of expectancy. It eats into my flesh. Dreams haunt me night and day. What will be the end? Now I am going down to see Mr. Cumberland again. I know what I shall see. The flickering of the fire behind his eyes, the lightning glances, the gentle, rare voice, the wasted face, and by him will be Kate Cumberland, and they both will seem to be listening. Listening. For what? No more tonight. But Longburn, you should be here. I feel that the like of this has never been upon the earth. Byron. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 19. Suspense. He found them as he had expected, the girl beside the couch and the old man prone upon it, wrapped to the chin in a gaudy Navajo blanket. But tonight his eyes were closed, a most unusual thing, and Byron could look more closely at the aged face. For on occasions when the eyes were wide, it was like looking into the throat of a searchlight to stare at the features. All was blurred. He discovered now wrinkled and purple-stained lids under the deep shadow of the brows, and eyes were so sunken that there seemed to be no pupils there. Over the cheekbones the skin was drawn so tightly that it shone, and the cheeks fell away into cadaverous hollows. But the lips beneath the shag of grey beard were tightly compressed. No, this was not sleep. It carried, as Byron gazed, a connotation of swifter, fiercer thinking than if the gaunt old man had stalked the floor and poured forth a triad of words. The girl came to meet the doctor. She said, "Will you use a narcotic?" "Why?" asked Byron. "He seems more quiet than usual." "Look more closely," she whispered. And when he obeyed, he saw that the whole body of Joe Cumberland quivered like an aspen, continually, so the finger of the duellist trembles on the trigger of his gun before he receives the signal to fire, a suspense more terrible than the actual face of death. "A narcotic," she pleaded, "something to give him just one moment of full relaxation." "I can't do it," said Byron. "If his heart were a shade stronger, I should, but as it is, the only thing that sustains him is the force of his will power. Do you want me to unnerve the very strength which keeps him alive?" She shuddered. "Do you mean that if he sleeps it will be death?" "I have told you before," said the doctor, "that there are phases of this case which I do not understand. I predict nothing with certainty, but I very much fear that if your father falls into a complete slumber he will never waken from it. Once let his brain cease functioning, and I fear the heart will follow suit." They stood on the farther side of the room and spoke in the softest of whispers, but now the deep, calm voice of the old man broke in. "Doc, there ain't no use of worrying. There ain't no use of medicine. All I need is quiet." "Do you want to be alone?" asked the girl. "No, not so long as you don't make no noise. I can most hear something, but your whispering shuts it off." They obeyed him with a glance at each other, and soon they caught the far-off beat of a horse in a rapid gallop. "Is it that?" cried Kate, leaning forward and touching her father's hand. "Is that horse what you hear?" "No, no," he answered impatiently. "That ain't what I hear. It ain't no hoss that I hear." The hoofbeats grew louder, stopped before the house. Steps sounded loud and rattling on the veranda. A door squeaked and slammed, and Buck Daniels stood before them. His hat was jammed down so far that his eyes were almost buried in the shadow of the brim. The bandana at his throat was twisted so that the knot lay over his right shoulder. He carried a heavy quirt in a hand that trembled so that the long lash seemed alive. 1,000 bits of foam had dried upon his vest and stained it. The rowels of his spurs were caked and enmeshed with horsehair. Dust covered his face and sweat furrowed it, and a keen scent of horse sweat passed from him through the room. For a moment he stood at the door bracing himself, with legs spread wide apart, and stared wildly about. Then he reeled drunkenly across the room and fell into a chair, sprawling at full length. No one else moved. Joe Cumberland had turned his head. Kate stood with her hand at her throat. The doctor had placed his hand behind his head, and there it stayed. "Gimme smoke, quick," said Buck Daniels. "Run out of Durham years ago." Kate ran into the next room and returned instantly with papers and a fresh sack of tobacco. On these materials Buck seized frantically, but his big fingers were shaking in a palsy, and the papers tore, one after another, as soon as he started to roll his smoke. "God!" he cried in a burst of childish desperation, and collapsed again in the chair. But Kate Cumberland picked up the papers and tobacco which he had dashed to the floor and rolled a cigarette with deft fingers. She placed it between his lips and held the match by which he lighted it. Once, twice, and again he drew great breaths of smoke into his lungs, and then he could open his eyes and look at them. They were not easy eyes to meet. "You're hungry, Buck," she said. "I can see it at a glance. I'll have something for you in an instant." He stopped her with a gesture. "I done it," said Buck Daniels. "He's comin'." The doctor flashed his glance upon Kate Cumberland, for when she heard the words she turned pale, and her eyes and her lips framed a mute question. But Joe Cumberland drew in a long breath and smiled. "I knowed it," he said softly. The wind whistled somewhere in the house, and it brought Buck Daniels leaping to his feet and into the centre of the room. "He's here!" he yelled. "God help me! Where'll I go now? He's here!" He had drawn his revolver and stood staring desperately about him as if he sought for a refuge in the solid wall. Almost instantly he recovered himself, however, and dropped the gun back into the holster. "No, not yet," he said, more to himself than the others. "It ain't possible, even for Dan." Kate Cumberland rallied herself, though her face was still white. She stepped to Buck and took both his hands. "You been working yourself to death," she said gently. "Buck, you're hysterical. What have you to fear from Dan? Isn't he your friend? Hasn't he proved it 1,000 times?" Her words threw him into a fresh frenzy. "If he gets me, it's blood on your head, Kate. It was for you I done it." "No, no, Buck. For Dan's sake alone. Isn't that enough?" "For his sake?" Buck threw back his head and laughed, a crazy laughter. "He could rot in hell for all of me. He could follow his wild geese around the world, Kate. It was for you." "Hush!" she pleaded. "Buck, dear." "Do I care who knows it? Not I. I got an hour, a half hour to live. And while I live the whole damn world can know I love you, Kate. From your spurs to the blue of your eyes. For your sake I brung him, and for your sake I'll fight him, damn him, in spite." The wind wailed again far off, and Buck Daniels cowered back against the wall. He had drawn Kate with him, and now he kept her before him towards the door. He began to whisper swiftly, with a horrible tremble in his voice. "Stand between me, Kate. Stand between me and him. Talk for me, Kate. Will you talk for me?" He drew himself up and caught a long, shuddering breath. "What have I been doing? What have I been raving about?" He looked about as if he saw the others for the first time. "Sit here, Buck," said Kate, with perfect quiet. "Give me your hat. There's nothing to fear. Now tell us." "A whole day and a whole night," he said, "I been riding with the fear of him behind me, Kate. I ain't myself. and if I been saying things " "No matter. Only tell me how you made him follow you." Buck Daniels swept his knuckles across his forehead as though to rub out a horrible memory. "Kate," he said in a voice which was hardly more than a whisper, "why did he follow Jim Silent?" The doctor slipped into a chair opposite Buck Daniels and watched him with unbelieving eyes. When he had last seen Buck the man had seemed an army in himself, but now a shivering, unmanned coward sat before him. Byron glanced at Kate Cumberland for explanation of the mysterious change. She also was transformed with horror, and she stared at Buck Daniels as at one already among the dead. "Buck, you didn't strike him?" Buck Daniels nodded jerkily. "I'll try to tell you straight from the beginning. I found Dan in Brownsville. I begged him to come back with me, but he wouldn't stir. This was why. A gunman had come to town looking for trouble, and when he run across Dan he found plenty of it. No, don't look like that, Kate. It was self-defense, pure and simple. They didn't even arrest Dan for it, but this dying man's brother, Mac Strann, come down from the hills and sat beside Jerry Strann waiting for him to go west before he started out to clean up on Dan. Yesterday evening Jerry was near dead and everybody in Brownsville was waiting to see what would happen, because Dan wouldn't budge till Mac Strann had had his chance to get back at him. So I sent a fellow ahead to fix a relay of hosses to Elkhead, because I made up my mind I was going to make Dan Barry chase me out of that town. I walked into the saloon where Dan was sitting, braiding a little horsehair strand. My God, Kate, think of him sitting there doing that with 100 fellows standing about waiting for him to kill or be killed. I went up to him. I picked a fight, and then I slapped him in the face." The sweat started on Daniels' forehead at the thought. "But you're still alive!" cried Kate Cumberland. "Had you handled his gun first?" "No. As soon as I hit him I turned my back to him and took a couple of steps away from him." "Oh, Buck, Buck!" she cried, her face lighting. "You knew he wouldn't shoot you in the back?" "I didn't know nothing. I couldn't even think, and my body was numb as a dead man's all below the hips. There I stood like I was chained to the floor. You know how it is in a nightmare when something chases you and you can't run. That was the way with me." "Buck, and he was sitting behind you while you stood there?" "Aye, sitting there with my death sitting on his trigger finger. But I knowed that if I showed the white feather, if I let him see me shake, he'd be out of his chair and on top of me. No, gun, he don't need nothing but his hands, and what was in front of my eyes was a death like Jim Silent's." He squinted his eyes closed and groaned. Once more he roused himself. "But I couldn't move a foot without my knees buckling, so I takes out my makin's and rolls a cigarette. And while I was doing it I was praying that my strength would come back to me before he come back to himself and started." "It was surprise that held him, Buck. To think of you striking him, you who have saved his life and fought for him like a blood brother. Oh, Buck, of all the men in the world you're the bravest and the noblest." "There ain't nothing in that brand of talk," growled Buck, reddening. "Anyway, at last I started for the door. It wasn't farther away than from here to that wall. Outside was my hoss and a chance for living, but that door was 1,000 years away, and 1,000 times while I walked towards it I felt Dan's gun click and bang behind me and felt the lead go tearing through me, and I didn't dare to hurry because I knew that might wake Dan up. So finally I got to the doors, and just as they were swinging to behind me I heard a sort of moan behind me." "From Dan?" whispered the white-faced girl. "I know. A sort of a stifled cry when he's angered. Oh, Buck!" "My first step took me 10 yards from that door," reminisced Buck Daniels, "and my next step landed me in the saddle, and I dug them spurs clean into the insides of Long Bess. She started like a watch spring uncoiling, and as she spurts down the streets I leans clean over to her mane and looks back, and there I seen Dan standing in the door with his gun in his hand and the wind blowing his hair. But he didn't shoot because the next second I was swallowed up in the dark and couldn't see him no more." "But it was no use!" cried the girl. With Black Bart to trail you and with Satan to carry him, he overtook you, and then " "He didn't," said Buck Daniels. "I fixed things so he couldn't get started with Satan for some time, and before he could have Satan on my trail I'd put a long stretch behind me, because Long Bess was racing every step. The lay of the land was with me. It was pretty level, and on level going Long Bess is almost as fast as Satan, but on rocky going Satan is like a goat. Nothing stops him. And I was riding Long Bess like to bust her heart, straight towards McCauley's. We wasn't more'n a mile away when I thought the wind was behind me, you see that I heard a sort of far off whistling down the wind. My God!" He could not go on for a moment, and Kate Cumberland sat with parted lips, twisting her fingers together and then tearing them apart once more. "Well, that mile was the worst in my life. I thought maybe the man I'd sent on ahead hadn't been able to leave me a relay at McCauley's, and if he hadn't I knew I'd die somewhere in the hills beyond. And they looked as black as dead men, and all sort of grinning down at me. But when I got to McCauley's there stood a hoss right in front of the house. It didn't take me 2 seconds to make the saddle change, and then I was off again." A sigh of relief came from Byron and Kate. "That hoss was a beauty. Not long-legged like Bess, nor half so fast, but he was just right for the hills. Climbed like a goat and didn't let up. Up we goes. The wind blows the clouds away when we get to the top of the climb, and I looks down into the valley all white in the moonlight. And across the valley I seen 2 little shadows sliding smooth and steady. It was Dan and Satan and Black Bart. Buck, my heart, it stood plumb still. I gives my hoss the spurs and we went down the next slope, and I don't remember nothing except that we got to the Circle K bar after a million years, most, and when we got there the piebald flops on the ground, near dead. But I made the change and started off again, and that next hoss was even better than the piebald, a sure goer. When he started I could tell by his gait what he was, and I looked up at the sky." He stopped, embarrassed. "And thanked God, Buck?" "Kate, I ain't ashamed if maybe I did. But since then I ain't seen or heard Dan. But all the time I rode I was expecting to hear his whistle behind me, close up." All the life died from her face. "No, Buck. If he'd of followed all the way he would have caught you in spite of your relay. No, I understand what happened. After a while he remembered that Mac Strann was waiting for him back in Brownsville, and he left your trail to be taken up later and went back to Brownsville. You didn't see him follow you after you left the Circle X bar?" "No, I didn't dare look back, but somehow I knew he was coming." She shook her head. "He won't come, Buck. He'll go back to meet Mac Strann, and then " She ran to the chair of Buck swiftly and caught his hands. "What sort of man is Mac Strann?" Buck smiled strangely up into her face. "Does it make any difference," he said, "to Dan?" She went slowly back to her place. "No," she admitted, "no difference." "If you came by relays for 24 hours," said the doctor, numbering his points upon accurate finger tips, "it is humanly impossible that this man could have followed you very closely. It will probably take him another day to arrive." But here his glance fell upon old Joe Cumberland, and found the cattleman smiling faintly to himself. Buck Daniels was considering the last remark seriously. "No," he said, "it ain't possible. Besides, what Kate says may be true. She ought to know. She says he'll wait for Mac Strann. I didn't think of that. I thought I was saving Dan from another well, what a damn fool I've been." He unknotted his bandana and with it mopped his face to a semblance of cleanliness. "It was riding that done it," he explained, shamefaced. "You put a man on a hoss for a certain time, and after a while he gets so he can't think. He's sort of nutty. That was the way with me when I come in." "Open the window on the veranda," said Joe Cumberland. "I want to feel the wind." The doctor obeyed the instruction, and again he noted the same quiet, contented smile on the lips of the old man. For some reason it made him ill at ease to see it. "He won't get here for 8 or 10 hours," went on Buck Daniels, easing himself into a more comfortable position and raising his head a little higher. "10 hours more. Even if he does come, that'll give me a chance to rest up, Right now I'm kind of shaky." "A condition, you will observe, in which Mr. Barry will also be when he arrives," remarked the doctor. "Shaky?" grinned Buck Daniels. "My friend, you don't know that bird." He sat up, clenching his fist. "And if Dan does come, he can't afford to press me too far. I'll take so much, and then " He struck his fist on the arm of the chair. "Buck," cried Kate Cumberland, "are you mad? Have you lost your reason? Would you face him?" Buck Daniels winced, but then he shook his head doggedly. "He had his chance down in Brownsville," he said, "and he didn't take it. Why? Because my back was turned. Well, he could of got in front of me if he had been terrible anxious. I've seen Dan in action. And he's seen me in action. Maybe he's seen too much. There's been stranger things than that in this world." He hitched his belt so that the butt of his revolver came farther forward. But now Kate Cumberland advised: "Buck, you're tired out. You don't know what you're saying. Better go up to bed." He flushed a ruddy bronze. "D'you think I'm just talking words, Kate, to hear myself talk?" "Listen," broke in Joe Cumberland, and raised a bony forefinger for silence. And the doctor noted a great change in the old man. There was no longer a tremor in his body. There was only a calm and smiling expectation, a certainty. A tinge of colour was in his withered face for the first time since Byron had come to the ranch. And now the cattleman raised his finger with such an air of calm authority that at once every voice in the room was stilled. "D'you hear?" They did not. They heard only the faint rushing of the air through the window. The flames danced in the chimney of the lamp and changed the faces in fantastic alteration. One and all they turned and faced the window. Still there was not a sound audible, but the doctor felt as if the noise were approaching. He knew it as surely as if he could see some far-off object moving near and nearer. And he knew as clearly that the others in the room felt the same thing. He turned his glance from the window towards Kate Cumberland. Her face was upturned. There was about it a transparent pallor. The eyes were large and darkly ringed, the lips parted into the saddest and most patient of smiles, and the slender fingers were interwoven and pressed against the base of her throat. For the first time he saw how the fire that was so manifest in the old man had been consuming her also. It left no mark of the coming of death upon her, but it had burned her pure and left her transparent as crystal. Pity swelled in the throat of Byron as he realized the anguish of her long waiting. Fear mingled with his pity. He felt that something was coming which would seize on her as the wind seizes on the dead leaf, whirling her off into an infinity of storm and darkness into which he could not follow a single pace. He turned back towards the window. The rush of air played steadily, and then in pulses, upon his face. Then even the wind ceased, as if it too were waiting. Not a sound, but silence has a greater voice than discord or music. It seemed to Byron that he could tell how fast each heart was beating. The old man had closed his eyes again, and yet the rigid forefinger remained raised, and the faint smile touched at the corners of his mouth. Buck Daniels sat lunging forward in his chair, his knees supporting his elbows, and scowled up at the window with a sort of sullen terror. Then Byron heard it. So small a voice that at first he thought it was only part of the silence. It grew and grew. In a sudden burst it was clear to every ear, the honking of the wild geese. And Byron knew the picture they made. He could see them far up in the sky, a dim triangle of winter grey, moving with the beat of lightning wings, each in an arrowy flight north and north and north. Creatures for sport all the world over. Here alone, in all the earth, in the heart of this mountain desert, they were in some mysterious wise messengers. Once more the far discord showered down upon them, died as they rose, perhaps, to a higher level, and was heard no more. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand, Chapter 20. The Coming. Then a padding step, light, lighter than the sound of the softest thought. It was passing near. The faint breeze blew the sound to them, around them, behind them. Each man felt as if some creature were stalking him, unseen. Next, it appeared by magic against the blue-black of the night, the head of a great wolf, quite black, shaggy, with sharply pointed ears, and the eyes stared at them, green eyes with lights that swirled as the flame jumped in the throat of the lamp. For a long moment the horror lasted. Then the head, as it had come, disappeared, and the light footfall faded away. Buck Daniels had risen now. The sound of his whisper made them start. "I'm going up to my room and lock the door. For God's sake, keep him away." And so he stole soundlessly away, and then they heard the creaks which announced his progress up the stairs. Not Buck Daniels alone. In the deadly silence Kate rose to her feet, and the old man, the invalid, he with the dead body and the living brain, rose from his couch and stood as erect as a soldier on parade. The doctor was conscious of repeating to himself, hurriedly, a formula something like this: "The thing which is coming is human. It cannot be more than human. As long as it is human, it is nothing to fear. The laws of truth are irrevocably fixed. The laws of science will not change." Yet, in spite of this formula, he was deadly cold, as if a wind were blowing through his naked soul. It was not fear. It was something beyond fear, and he would not have been otherwhere for any reward. All his mind remained poised, expectant, as the astronomer waits for the new star which his calculations have predicted to enter the field of his telescope. He caught the sound of another horse coming, far different even to his unpracticed ear from the beat of hoofs which announced the coming of Buck Daniels. The rhythm of their fall was slower, as if the stride of the animal were much longer. He pictured a mighty creature with a vast mane blown back against the chest of a giant rider. There was a murmur from Kate: "Dan, my dear, my dear." Then he heard a padding footfall, hardly louder than the light step of the wolf. The knob of the door turned slowly. Without a sound it opened, and a man stepped in. He was not larger than the doctor, a slender fellow, almost dapper in his dress, with hardly a sign of travel about him, except that the brim of his sombrero was folded back from his face as if from continual pressure of wind. These things Randall Byrne noted vaguely. What he was sharply aware of were the eyes of the man. He had the feeling that he had seen them before. He remembered the yellow light that had swirled in the eyes of the wolf at the window. The newcomer flashed a glance about the room, yet for all its speed it seemed to linger an instant on each face, and when it crossed the stare of Byron the doctor shrank. "Where's Buck?" asked the man. "I've come for him." As if in answer, the great shaggy dog slipped through the entrance past his master and glided across the room. As he passed, Kate held out a hand to him. She called softly, "Bart," but she was greeted with a silent baring of fangs, and she caught her hand back against her breast, with the tears springing in her eyes. On the other side of the room the black dog paused and looked back to his master, while Byron realized with a shudder that the door before which it stood was the door through which Buck Daniels had disappeared. Straight to that door Barry stepped, and Byron realized with an eerie emotion that the footfalls made no sound. Before he reached the door, however, the girl started forward and sprang before him. With her outstretched arms she barred the way. Her skirt brushed almost in the face of the dog, and the beast shrank away, not in fear, but crouching in readiness to leap. The sharp ears twitched back. A murderous snarl rolled up from between the wicked teeth. Yet she did not cast a single glance at him. She faced the greater danger. She was sane. Whatever Buck did, it wasn't done to hurt you, Dan. It was done for your own sake, and for Dad's sake. You shan't pass here." From his position the doctor could not see the face of Dan Barry, but he guessed at it through the expression of Kate. Such terror and horror were in her eyes, as though she were facing a death's head inches away. Then he saw the slender hand of Barry rise and move towards the girl slowly, trembling, as though one fierce impulse urged him to thrust her to one side and as though another held back his arm. The doctor could not watch the girl longer. Fear and pity were wringing him as he lowered his glance to the floor. Then he heard her cry, "Have you forgotten me, like Bart? Like Bart, have you forgotten me, Dan?" His hand fell to his side, and he glided back from her, but now Byron could see that the eyes of Barry were looking past the girl, as though he stared through the solid wood of the door and found his prey beyond it. The stranger slipped towards the door by which he had entered, with the great dog slinking at his heels. Kate Cumberland leaned heavily against the wall, her arm thrown across her face, but there was no consciousness of her in the face of Barry. Yet at the very door he paused and straightened. Byron saw that he was staring towards Joe Cumberland, and the old man reached a bony hand out. "Oh, lad," he said softly, "I've been waiting for you years and years, seems like." Barry crossed the room as noiselessly, as swiftly as a flying shadow. "Sit down," he commanded, and Byron caught a faint ring in the voice, like the shiver of metal striking steel. Joe Cumberland obeyed without a word, and then lay back at full length upon the couch. A palsy had seized on him, and the hand which rested on the shoulder of Dan Barry was shaking. By the couch came the tall dog, and crouched, staring up in the master's face. Then the younger man turned his face toward Byron and the girl. Those thin-cut nostrils expanded, the lips compressed, and Byron dared not look into the flare of the eyes. "Who done this?" asked Barry, and still the shiver of cold metal rang in his voice. "Who done this?" "Steady, lad," said Joe Cumberland faintly. "There ain't no call for fightin'. Steady, Dan boy, and don't leave me." Byron caught a signal from Kate and followed her obediently from the room. "Let them be alone," she said. "Impossible," protested the doctor. "Your father is lapsed into a most dangerous condition. The physical inertia which has held him for so long is now broken, and I look for a dangerous mental and nervous collapse to accompany it. A sedative is now imperative." He laid his hand on the knob of the door to return, but the girl blocked his way. "Don't go in," she commanded feebly. "I can't explain to you. All I can say is that Dad was the one who found Dan Barry, and there's something between them that none of us understand. But I know that he can help Dad. I know Dad is in no danger while Dan is with him." "A pleasant superstition," nodded the doctor, "but medicine, my dear Miss Cumberland, does not take account of such things." "Doctor Byron," she said, rallying a false strength for the argument, "I insist. Don't ask me to explain." "In that case," he answered coldly, "I cannot assume responsibility for what may happen." She made a gesture of surrender weakly. "Look back in on them now," she said. "If you don't find father quiet, you may go into him." Doctor Byron obeyed, opening the door softly. He saw Joe Cumberland prone, of course, upon the couch. One hand lay, as usual, across his breast, but the other was at his side, clasped in the hands of Dan Barry. The old cattleman slept. Yes, there was no doubt that for the first time in many days he slumbered soundly. The lean, narrow chest rose and fell with deep, slow breaths. The eyes were closed, and there was no twitching of muscles to betray ragged nerves or a mind that dreamed fiercely while the body slept. Far over the sleeping man leaned the stranger, as if he were peering closely into the closed eyes of Joe Cumberland. There was a tenseness of watching and waiting in his attitude, like the runner on the mark, or like the burden bearer lifting a great weight, and Byron gathered, in some mysterious manner, the impression that Barry sent through his hands and into the body of Cumberland a continual stream of nervous strength, an electric thing. Nonsense, of course. And it was nonsense also to think that the huge dog, which lay staring up into the face of the master, understood all this affair much better than the practised mind of the physician. Yet the illusion held with Randall Byron, in spite of all his skepticism. He was certain that he had made not the slightest sound in opening the door, but presently the head of the watcher turned slowly, and Byron was looking into those same yellow, terrible eyes. At the same instant the sick man moaned faintly. The doctor closed the door as softly as he had opened it, and turned a drawn face upon Kate Cumberland. "I don't understand it. It isn't possible," he whispered. "No one understands," said the girl, and smiled mirthlessly. "Don't try to, Dr. Byron. Go to bed and sleep if you can. Good night." "But you," said Byron, following her, "are almost as ill as your father. Is there nothing I can do for you?" "You?" she asked, surprised. "No, nothing." "But there is not the slightest colour in your face, and you are trembling, Miss Cumberland." She did not seem to hear him. "Will he stay?" she asked of herself. "Will he leave before the morning?" "I shall see that he stays," said the doctor. "I will stay here outside the door, and see that he does not leave, if you wish." Once more she smiled in that baffling manner. "Could you keep the wind from blowing, Dr. Byron? If I thought that he could be kept—" She stopped. "He has forgotten us. He has forgotten all of us except Dad, and if Dad cannot keep him, nothing will keep him. It is useless for you to wait here. Good night again, Dr. Byron." He watched her up the stairs. By the dim light he saw her hand catching at the balustrade, as if she were drawing herself up step by step. When she reached the landing and turned half towards him, he saw that her head was fallen. "Not a glance, not a thought for me," murmured the doctor. "But if the stranger does leave—" Instead of finishing the muttered sentences, he drew a chair back against the wall and sat down with folded hands to wait. Chapter 21